BLM is a Marxist organization. BLM is a Marxist organization using the black struggle as a Trojan horse to sneak in their Marxism to destroy our country. Then digs deeper into the roots and finds that it goes all the way to the 1800s. Let's talk about it, y'all. Middle America. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to bring your attention to another form of Marxist infiltration in American history. Now, I'm sure many of you beautiful people know that, especially if you're a Christian, you can absolutely not support Black Lives Matter because, as the young lady said, she is a trained Marxist. And so anyone having anything to do with Marx and his ideology is obviously evil and should be thoroughly denounced by Christians, especially American Christians, because capitalism is obviously an inspired economic doctrine that descended from the seven heavens. For those of you who are not familiar with Marxism and Marxist thoughts, now I've been reading a lot of Marx recently, and the reason for that is because I do not like talking about issues unless I am at some level familiar with those issues. And so I've been hearing and seeing a lot of people talk about Marxism as if it's the doctrine of the Antichrist, but literally 100 times out of 100, when I ask these people, how much Marx have you read? The answer is always 0. Now, I'm sure there are some critiques or critics of Marx out there that are actually informed about what Marx actually said and did. But those people probably are not criticizing BLM, because if you go to BLM's webpage, you could see that there isn't very much thoughtful Marxism on the BLM page. Now, here's what I will say about Marxism. Marx's general idea, from what I can ascertain right now, I'm in the middle of Das Kapital, which is his sort of magnum opus, or the most popular work. You can also read the Communist Manifesto that he did with his buddy Engels. But basically, he looked at the world through the lens of class struggle, and he believed that the story of human beings could be whittled down to, in my mind, an oversimplistic war between the bourgeoisie, which was also always a small oligarchy of very rich people, and the proletariat, who were the workers, who were always taken advantage of by the bourgeoisie. So you have slavery in the ancient Near East, you've got, serfdom in Europe, and then you've got, what modern Marxists look at as the capitalist system, which perpetuates that situation, which we will be talking about in another video. What's very, very interesting, I'm on the Washington Post right now. I'll put the link in the description. I'm going to read you guys something. Now here's what we're told. Because Sister said something positive about Marx, we should completely disavow her movement. And on top of that, this is proof that BLM is not about black liberation. It is not about police brutality. What this is really about is the destruction of our country by a communist sort of Trojan horse. The BLM is really trying to reorient the American society into a Marxist wasteland and hellscape, and that they're just using the black struggle as a Trojan horse to get in. But we are smarter than that. That's what we're told. That's why we need to disavow BLM. It's not because you're a racist, and it's not because you have a vested interest in the current situation remaining as it is. No, no, no. It's not because you're afraid of actual equality in America, where jackbooted Gestapo tactics used by our police department are controlled. It's not because of that. It's because you love your country and you're godly, and you have insight into the Marxist conspiracy. Dear friend, what you need to do is go farther than BLM, because this Marxist conspiracy has been around since the 1800s. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I will expose it to you now. Here's a document written 27 July 2019. It was December 1861, a Tuesday at noon, when President Abraham Lincoln sent his first annual message, what later became the State of the Union, to the House and the Senate. And here is what Brother Lincoln said. For his eloquent closer, he chose not a soliloquy on unity or freedom, but an 800-word meditation on what the Chicago Tribune subtitled Capital versus Labor. Labor is prior to and independent of capital, Mr. Lincoln said. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves the much higher consideration. Now, anybody, you don't even have to read Das Kapital yet. You can simply read the Communist Manifesto and know that that is Mr. Karl Marx. We read, if you think that that sounds something like Karl Marx would write, well, that might be because Lincoln was regularly reading Karl Marx. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, what Mr. Lincoln just said is actually basically a paraphrase of another tract that Mr. Marx wrote called Labor and Capital. President Trump has added a new arrow in his quiver of attacks of late, charging that a vote for any Democrat in the next election is a vote for the rise of radical socialism, where he calls Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other congresswomen of color a bunch of communists. Now, I don't really think that Mr. Trump cares what color they are, if they are communist or socialist or Marxist, because, you know, he's the uber capitalist. So I don't really think the color has much to do in this particular situation. Of course, Lincoln was not a socialist, nor communist, nor Marxist. Just as House Speaker Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders, they would call themselves democratic socialists. But Lincoln and Marx, born only 9 years apart, were contemporaries. They had many mutual friends, they read each other's work, and in 1865 exchanged letters. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Marx exchanged letters and correspondences and friends. We continue. Unbelievable stuff. They were anti-slavery, pro-worker, and sometimes overtly socialist, according to John Nichols, the author of the book The S Word, A Short History of an American Tradition, Socialism. The New York Tribune, which was the newspaper largely responsible for transmitting the ideals and ideas that formed the Republican Party in 1854, championed the redistribution of land in the American West to the poor and the emancipation of slaves. Please note that the New York Tribune, which was the media arm for what became the Republican Party, were championing the redistribution of land of the American West to the poor and the freedom of slaves. Greeley welcomed the disapproval of those who championed free markets over the interests of the working class. Horace Greeley was a fellow Whig. The Whig Party was what Lincoln was before it became a Republican Party. A fellow Whig who served briefly alongside Lincoln. Greeley was better known as the founder of the New York Tribune. Okay, so this is Greeley, who founded the New York Tribune, who was advocating for the redistribution of land to the poor and the emancipation of slaves. Greeley welcomed the disapproval of those who championed free markets. These would be the capitalist fundamentalists. Over the interest of the working class, a class he recognized as include both the oppressed slaves of the South and the degraded industrial workers of the North. That means that Greeley valued labor over capital, which is one of the hallmarks of socialism. We continue. Across the Atlantic, another man linked the fates of enslaved and wage workers, Mr. Marx, upon publishing the Communist Manifesto, which you can read in one sitting. With Friedrich Engels in 1848, the German philosopher sought refuge in London after a failed uprising in the German Confederation. Marx was intensely, watch this, Marx was intensely interested in the plight of American slaves. In January 1860, he told Engels that the two biggest things happening in the world, now this is Marx, who told his buddy Engels, and Marx and Engels worked together on the tract, The Communist Manifesto. This is what he said were the two biggest issues happening in the world right now. On the one hand, the movement of the slaves in America started by the death of John Brown, and on the other hand, the movement of serfs in Russia. You remember John Brown, the white abolitionist dude setting fire to plantations, etc., using violence to instigate abolition of slavery. Marx approved of Brown, and he approved of the emancipation of slaves. He equated Southern slaveholders with European aristocrats, Blackburn writes, and thought ending chattel slavery would not destroy capitalism, but it would create conditions far more favorable to organizing and elevating labor, whether white or black. So Marx was all for the emancipation of the slaves. The capitalists were not, in the main. Marx was also friends with Charles A. Dana, an American socialist fluent in German, who was the managing editor of the New York Tribune. In 1852, Dana hired Marx to be the newspaper's British correspondent. So you got this media arm called the New York Tribune, which was basically the media arm of the Republican Party. It is basically owned and ran by Charles A. Dana, an American socialist. He then hires Karl Marx to write as the British correspondent for the Tribune. Over the next decade, Mr. Marx wrote nearly 500 articles for the paper. Many of his contributions became unsigned columns appearing on the front page as the publication's official position. Marx later borrowed liberally from his New York Tribune writings for his book Kapital, according to Nichols. You know, Das Kapital, where I said that was. He basically lifted a bunch of the articles that he wrote for the Tribune to write that book. Like a lot of nascent Republicans, Lincoln was an avid reader of the Tribune. The Tribune, owned by a socialist and written largely by Karl Marx. It nearly guaranteed that in the 1850s, Lincoln was regularly reading Marx's material. In 1860, two major factors helped to propel Lincoln. And so he talks about a one-term governor, and then he said, and second, the support of the party's newspaper, the Tribune. So the Tribune was supporting Lincoln exclusively, and the Tribune was run by a socialist and Marx himself. Once Lincoln took office, his alliance with socialists did not stop. Dana left the Tribune to become Lincoln's eyes and ears in the War Department, following along with troop movements and telling Lincoln what he thought of his generals. So the person who was running Lincoln's War Department was the socialist Dana, who hired Karl Marx to write for the Tribune. Really continued to urge Lincoln to take a harder line against slavery, to make the Civil War not just about preserving the Union, but also about abolition. Marx did the same in the pages of the Tribune. So this media arm that was supporting Lincoln was also putting pressure on him to make emancipation front and center. Why? Because the socialist ideal is to stick up for the worker over and against the bourgeoisie, which in this particular situation would be the slave owners. In 1863, they got what they wanted when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Under the pressure from the socialists and Marx himself, he capitulated and initiated the Emancipation Proclamation. In January 1865, Marx wrote to Lincoln on behalf of the International Workingmen's Association, a group for socialists, communists, anarchists, and trade unionists, to congratulate the American people on your re-election. Listen to what Marx says. He said an oligarchy of 300,000 slave owners had defiled the Republic, and that the working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working class. This is Marx saying this to Mr. Lincoln. A few weeks later, a reply came in which Mr. Lincoln said that he accepted this commendation with a sincere and anxious desire that he may be able to prove himself not unworthy of the confidence which has been recently extended to him by fellow citizens and by so many of the friends of humanity and progress throughout the world. Both letters ran in newspaper across Britain and the United States. Marx was delighted, telling Engels, remember Engels is the guy that he worked with to write the Communist Manifesto, that it created such a sensation that the bourgeoisie in private clubs were shaking their heads at it. Remember, Marx's entire perspective on the world is that the human story could be told as a class war between the bourgeoisie, a small group of people who took all the wealth for themselves, and the proletariat who were there to serve them. And he was saying that Lincoln's anti-slavery movement and the emancipation of slaves was a big win for socialists and communists, and that the bourgeoisie, which would be the rich, the capitalists, were very, very angry and shaking their heads about it. Lincoln never took up the mantle of socialism. He believed in the system of wage labor, even as he proposed reforms to it. Marx rejected it as another form of slavery, but Lincoln certainly viewed socialists as allies. As Nichols writes, it is indisputable that the Republican Party had at its founding a red streak. Now, again, when I read Das Kapital in the middle of that, and I read the Communist Manifesto, and then Capital and Labor, and then I compare what I see to BLM, I know for a fact that those people, God bless them, are not very conversant with Marx at all, or at least they've rejected a vast majority of Marx's thought. But because Sister said something nice about Marx, I'm now supposed to reject the movement wholesale. It was also noted by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King Jr. in February 1968, at a celebration of life of W.E.B. Du Bois at Carnegie Hall, King brought up that the co-founder of the NAACP became a communist in his later years. You don't say. It is worth noting, King said, that Abraham Lincoln warmly welcomed the support of Karl Marx during the Civil War and corresponded with him freely. Our irrational, obsessive anti-communism has led us into too many quagmires to be retained as if it were a mode of scientific thinking. And do you know what the FBI did with Dr. King during the 60s? They put out a propaganda blitz called COINTELPRO, and one of their pieces of argumentation was that Martin Luther King was a communist and he was a Marxist. Martin Luther King said very nice things about Marxism. I just read you one where he talked very nicely about Marxism and connected Marx to Abraham Lincoln. And do you know all these folks who are talking about how BLM should be ignored because they're Marxists and they know BLM's real agenda? These same people would be saying the exact same thing about Abraham Lincoln. They've been saying, this isn't about slaves. This isn't about slavery. This is about Marxism. Abraham Lincoln is quoting Marxist. He's friends with Marxist. He took a guy from the Marxist paper. These Republicans, they're all Marxist. He took a guy from a Marxist paper. I mean, good night. The guy hired Marx as the British correspondent, and now he's the war consultant. Follow the money trail, people. That's what they would have been saying. They would have been saying, this guy, Abraham Lincoln, is just using slavery as a Trojan horse for Marxism. And then all the racist capitalists would have felt completely secure and completely justified in ignoring the plight of the slaves and the cry of emancipation, because they would have been able to say, this is Marxism. You see? And that's what, if you would have had a Facebook page during the Civil War, that is exactly what these folks would have been saying. You know it, and I know it. And you will also note that Mr. King also said very nice things about Marx. He said a lot more about Marx and demonstrated more conversance with Marx than anybody in BLM. And that is literally what the FBI and a whole bunch of other white folks were saying about Dr. King as well. And now we've got BLM, and unfortunately people are so uneducated about this fact that I had a very nice, well-meaning white lady tell me that I should not say things like Black Lives Matter, and I should take up, for example, the spirit of Dr. King. And I said, ma'am, you're misinformed, because Dr. King said way more good things about Marx than anybody in BLM. And Dr. King read and showed conversance with Marx, and I don't see that from anybody in BLM. To which she promptly responded by fleeing the conversation, which is fine. Maybe she fled the conversation to go read and educate herself. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying that you're ignorant, because saying that you're ignorant is simply an acceptance of the fact that you're not God, because God is the only self-taught one. He's the only self-guided one. He's the only one that knows everything. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that you have no idea about the connection between the Republican Party and Marxism. There's nothing wrong with the fact that you don't know that Marx was one of the folks that was pushing for the emancipation of slaves, and that Mr. Lincoln had very good correspondences with Marx. There's nothing wrong with that. Now educate yourself. There's nothing wrong with you not knowing that Dr. King had very nice things to say about Marx, although Dr. King disagreed with Marx at the fundamental level, just as I do. As I said, I do not believe being rich is the problem, and I don't believe being poor makes you righteous. What I believe is that I believe in original sin, and that anytime you combine sin with power, you're going to get some horrible ism. That's what I believe. So I do not believe that capitalism is a godly system, and I don't believe that Jesus was a capitalist. I don't believe that Jesus was a Marxist either. I'm a postmillennialist. I believe we're going to figure something out later on that isn't as predatory as capitalism and as statist as socialism. But we're not going to get that progress as long as Christians continue to pretend that capitalism is some sort of sanctified, holy economic system, and that the heroes of our country were all capitalists, and that capitalists embraced all the heroes of our country. That's not true. It's completely untrue. Mr. Lincoln obviously had good, deep friendships and relationships with socialists, communists, and he wasn't pen pals with Marx, but he was very educated in Marxist thought, and it obviously unequivocally inspired him at least to move toward the Emancipation Proclamation. And the last thing I'll say is you have to be very, very careful with this silly knee-jerk reaction that anytime somebody on the right now calls somebody a Marxist, you can then completely ignore them, because you might find yourself being on the side of the slaveholders during the Civil War, or being on the side of the Jim Crow folks during the 60s. I will post all of the link in the description, as I always do. And all I can say after that is educate yourself. Again, for full disclosure, I'm not a Marxist. I do not believe that Marx had the fundamental diagnosis of the human condition down properly. He was not operating from a Christian worldview, and as such, he's always going to make a fundamental error from my perspective if you don't start from a Christian worldview. However, his criticisms of capitalism are valid, and we would do well to look at it. And it should trouble you. If you believe, here's what I'll leave you with. If you're one of these people that believes that capitalism is the just descended from Valhalla down to us, then why is it that men like Lincoln were inspired by Marx, men like King were inspired by Marx? Why is that? These people who at pivotal moments in our history in the fight for justice, and I'm not saying they were perfect men, but I'm saying the people in the pivotal points of our history in fights for justice between the slave trade abolition and the end of Jim Crow. Why is it that they were very inspired by Marx, and the people opposing them were actively and self-consciously opposed to Marx? But now when you look back, you believe that the pro-Marxist people were actually right in that particular social struggle? Does that bother you? Does that make you think that maybe your knee-jerk reaction against BLM because they're supposedly Marxist and they're here to smuggle in Marxism? Do you think that maybe that you could once again be on the wrong side of history so that all decent, God-fearing, and people of goodwill, theist or atheist, Christian or non-Christian, Muslim or Buddhist, in the future will look back on this generation and the silliness that people are using to discount the movement of Black Lives Matter? Does it trouble you that maybe you might be one of those people? Love your neighbor. Take care of each other.